Thank you very much indeed for joining us today for this sixth live webinar in our 12-part series. I'm sorry for having to reschedule from last week due to illness, but today we are going to be looking at background checking policies. It's something I've been talking to customers about for many years, but I'd wager that many more employers still don't have appropriate policy in place. Now, don't worry, if that's you too, you've definitely come to the right place. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm David Cole, also known as DC, Head of Product Strategy here at EBC Global, and I'm delighted to be joined again today by the wonderful independent background screening consultant, Anton Watson. Anton, good morning.
Morning. Thanks for having me, David.
Thanks very much for joining us today. Between us, Anton and I have over 40 years of dedicated background screening experience. Both worked for some of the biggest background checking companies and some of the largest organizations in the world. But before we get into a more detailed introduction, I'll just quickly run through what we're going to be covering in today's webinar. So the topic is enhancing your background screening policy for safer hiring practices. That's what we're all looking to achieve. And we'll be kicking things off by sharing some industry insights. Hopefully everybody can see the presentation. I see some hands up, but unfortunately there's no interaction today. So I'm going to just press on unless I see a lot of hands suggesting that there's a problem with the technology. So we're going to start off by sharing some of the industry insights, hot topics and trends that might be affecting many of you here today. We'll then cover why we're talking about background checking policies and what are the emerging threats and where do those threats come from. And we'll go on to explain why it's so important to have a background checking policy, or even better, an effective one. So understanding these threats should really help hit home the need for an effective policy. Then we'll cover how to create a background checking policy and the 4 key areas we think is vital to consider when doing so. And then we'll go on to cover some of the best policy practices and how guidance on how to enhance your existing policies. And as always, we'll be looking to leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of today's session. And then we'll tackle what's next in our webinar series. So please do make sure you stay around to the end to vote on the next topic. Now, as always, if you've attended our webinars before, there will be some polls dotted throughout the webinar just to gauge your understanding and awareness and help us steer the discussion as well, and also follow-ups. So please do feel free to post any and all questions using the Q&A tab. Now, there's no chat, as I mentioned earlier, but you can start a discussion. Please don't do that one, but use the Q&A tab instead. Start a question, and we will answer as many of those questions as we can during a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Now, polls. If the polls don't work for you, please be aware that it's likely to be your own organization security settings that prevent you from using the polls on Microsoft Teams. It's not us, it's them. So if we can kick off with a quick poll just to familiarize yourself with how to use them. That's great to see that quite a lot of you are somewhat confident about policies, although we've got a quite a split between neutral and not so confident as well. But as I say, you're here in the right place if you want any help with regards to screening policies. So I'm delighted to introduce the star of today's show, Mr. Anton Watson from Background Check Advisory. To those of you who've not already had the pleasure, Anton began his career in recruitment, learning and development, and human resources, working across Asia Pacific region before moving to London to work for one of the UK's founding background check organisations, Control Risks Screening. And after 5 successful years, poacher turned gamekeeper, and Anton joined Bank of America to manage their background check and client due diligence program for a dozen years. Anton's got extensive experience in the background checking and HR industry and has gained unique insights into creating successful background checking programs, mitigating hiring and insider risks with effective background screening policies. And now, as Director of Background Check Advisory, Anton provides expertise on background checking policies, processes, everything just to enhance the screening practices across multiple industries. He's simply the best subject matter expert to join us for today's session. So thank you very much, Anton. Looking forward to your input very soon. But before we get on to Anton, I just want to talk about why we're talking about policies today, screening policies, background check policies, vetting policies, call them what you like. We're going to go through some of the recent regulation, industry trends, and examples of these trends in real life as well, by just looking at the changes to BPSS vetting for the public sector as an example. So, of course, one thing that impacts every employer in the UK is right-to-work checks. And with £30 million in fines issued by the Home Office last year for right-to-work breaches, it's clearly something that we all need to get right. So it's really good news, I think, that DBS and Home Office guidelines for ID checks are going to be further harmonised, which should ultimately lead to a much better candidate experience, providing clarity for both employers and background checkers. And then, of course, back end of last year, October 24, saw the implementation of the Worker Protection Act. That was the subject of the most recent webinar, a topic that we've extensively covered already and would really actively encourage all employers to take seriously, just to help tackle the big issue of preventing sexual harassment in and around the workplace. And of course, we did 2 topics in our previous seminar, and ECTA, the UK government's measures to process transformation changes and help tackling fraud. It's got a strong focus on failure to preventing fraud as well, which is going to become essentially a crime for large organisations. And that really comes into play later this year on September the 1st. So it's worth also noting that the measures that have been listed within ECTA are deemed as best practice guidance for all organisations to follow as well. And of course, in the most recent guidance, they highlighted that effective vetting and screening is the number one defence for all organisations in accomplishing this. In terms of industry trends, there's lots that we could highlight, but I really just want to focus on the 6 key points. Instant employment verifications. I'm sure some of you will have heard a lot about that, particularly EBC customers and prospects. These are really cost efficient, highly effective and very fast checks, the way that we'll be launching as a product very, very soon in our employment history verification check. That'll be coming in February, and that really should be a game changer for many, many organisations who use traditional referencing at the moment to either complement or replace those checks. Social media checks, when done well by professionals, but not really by internal recruitment teams, I would advise. These are without doubt the most valuable of all background checks currently available in terms of risk identity and mitigation. And demand for these checks continues to rise exponentially. So we were really pleased to launch this as a new check to our customers at the back end of last year. Next topic is really the use of AI in recruitment and screening. This can and will be a topic in itself over the coming months. And indeed, Anton's going to be helping bring to life this topic in just a few short moments too. So to alibi mills, reference houses. It's really staggering, in fact, the lengths that some fraudulent businesses will go to provide individuals with fake and verifiable employment and academic backgrounds. And these fake backgrounds will be all but the very best screening teams and processes. So do drop us a question if you want to know more about this today. It should come as no surprise that more and more employers are implementing rescreening programs as well, whether that's to meet regulatory requirements, which are becoming more and more prevalent with rechecks and ongoing vetting. Employers just getting finally on board with the concept that pre-employment checks alone are insufficient risk mitigation to combat internal threats and insider fraud. It's great to know at that point in time, but unless you're continually monitoring and rechecking, you're not going to be aware of threats that are emerging from within. So the numbers backing this up around internal fraud are quite staggering, and the topic will be the base another EBC Global webinar over the coming months. And the next slide might be a bit of an eye-opener too. And finally, share code fraud. This is something that a lot of you might not be aware of, but I think everybody should at least know that this activity is going on. It's where imposters are selling share codes in an attempt to beat the right-to-work checking system. So fraudsters posing as legitimate employees or representatives of organisations seeking to obtain share codes from unsuspecting individuals, and those stolen share codes are then sold back on the black market or just used by criminals to falsely verify right to work in the UK for unauthorised individuals. So think people smugglers, modern slavery gangs, and if nothing else, this really shows the importance of undertaking imposter checks as part of your right to work checks in order to obtain your statutory excuse as an employer. So really, those are all the reasons why, combined when taken into consideration, it's so important to have an effective background screening policy. Now, insider fraud, as I mentioned a moment ago, if you've not considered rescreening and ongoing vetting before, hopefully you will after we take a look at all of the different places that insider fraud can come at you from. So Malicious insiders, first and foremost, these are the ones that most of you would probably automatically think of. Disgruntled employees, compromised contractors and activists, anyone who's looking to harm the organization or indeed seek personal gain, especially in these very difficult times of economic pressures and uncertainty. Fraudsters, the next one, another very obvious one, but people or groups seeking to gain access to an organization, a targeted organization, to carry out fraudulent activities once they're inside. This is the easiest way to achieve this is by becoming an employee or securing a role, a contract within an organization. Hence the need for effective vetting and screening programs, not only for employees, but for contractors and third parties and associated persons as well. Negligent insiders. Think of the phrase loose lips sink ships, a term coined during World War II when careless and lazy behaviour, just talking out of place, led to all sorts of disasters, and failure to follow safeguards and security protocols can open a door to all sorts of fraud and data mishandling. So the next one on the list is unwitting insiders, and this is really the target of social engineering. It's a term that you might have heard of or might be very familiar with, but I'm sure you will have all been briefed at some stage on phishing and indeed spear phishing threats as part of security awareness training. And malicious links, phone calls, personalized messages, urgent requests essentially from seemingly trusted sources. But these type of frauds have cost organizations, including the likes of Facebook and Google, as much as $100 million in single targeted attacks. So it can happen in any organization as well. So next on the list is hacktivists, and these are individuals or groups that are motivated by political, social, or ideological causes, seeking to disrupt or publicize their political agenda or their own agendas. And the threats could literally stem from any country and for any motivation. Probably best to think of like WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning, the US Army intelligence analyst who was responsible for one of the largest leaks of classified information in US history. And this alone resulted in all sorts of reforms and measures being implemented, including insider threat programs and enhanced vetting procedures that crucially included much more thorough background checks and vitally the introduction of continuous evaluation and ongoing vetting. So this is how these policies really interact with each other. Cause equals effect, and this is why policies need to be constantly evaluated and enhanced. Nation state actors, so government affiliated groups or intelligence agencies that are engaged in espionage or sabotage. Highly topical at the moment, and these are often attacking critical infrastructure or strategic sectors. With all that's going on in the world at the moment, there are lots of things that we could identify, but I like to sort of talk about the SolarWinds attack. It happened back in 2020 when Russian state-sponsored actors targeted a US software company to infiltrate government networks or networks used by government agencies in the States and caused all sorts of problems for the government at the time. And finally, organised crime syndicates. These really shouldn't be overlooked, but these are large crime gangs that can carry out all sorts of illegal activities, including extortion, fraud and theft. Obviously think of the mafia, the triads, the cartels and the Yakuza from Japan. Wherever there are large reward opportunities, there will always be great risks to mitigate. So before I hand over to Anton, let's just have a really quick run through the evolving threat landscape. Specifically how extensive use of AI has led to significant increase in fraud all across the recruitment process and onboarding and background screening. Now, these all pose new threats and new challenges for employers across the world. And if you weren't aware already, you will be very soon. AI tools have been exploited to perpetrate sophisticated fraud across each of the stages of the recruitment process now, all the way from the simple CV right through to background screening and everything in between. So it's now my great pleasure to hand over to Anton to delve into each of these evolving threats and ultimately understand how an effective background screening policy can help uncover any unresolved issues with robust and reliable employment check programs. This is really the last line of defense for your organization. So Anton, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, David. I appreciate it. I think we'll just continue the conversation the slide that you just showed, really. Just wanted to give a couple of examples of how easy it can actually be to bypass a traditional background check program now, to further reiterate why having an up-to-date or current background check policy is important. So the first one I think we're showing is just, a very simple tool that's available online to help you create a resume for specific jobs, to help you bypass that part of the process. I think if we move to the next slide, we also go on to show how easy, again, using artificial intelligence, you can get through the job application process. So we're hearing more and more about automated job applications happening, and that becoming quite a problem for organizations, just the sheer number of applications that people are making. And again, that is being driven by technology. I think if we continue to the next slide, we can go further. There's also tools available to help people pass assessments in the onboarding or interview process. So, so far the screenshots we've shown you can get you right through to perhaps an interview and even an assessment process. I think if we continue, David, as well, we also give an example on the next slide, which is talking about how to help you through the interview process. So we've all heard of ChatGPT. That can obviously be used for interview preparation. There are instances of people we're hearing having their mobile phone next to their computer, listening to questions that are being asked, and that's obviously feeding it to them. But we've also now aware of things like interview co-pilots that can be downloaded to programs such as Teams. When you're doing a virtual interview, it's listening to you and providing a transcript on the screen to allow you to answer it seamlessly. So you would never know that that's actually happened. So we're just sort of highlighting on these slides how quickly it is evolving. And the last one that I wanted to show about how the landscape really is quite scary right now. There are a couple of things on this slide. The first thing, you can see a photograph of Keanu Reeves there, but that's actually an example of a website that popped up last year. And it was called essentially a deepfake website that is passing background check verification processes. So ID verification, it is passing that. It was reported in the media and it has disappeared currently. But what it highlights is that the technology is evolving even further to help you bypass traditional ID checking processes. You can find reference houses online. There's Career Excuse that we're showing you there. There's also a copy of a diploma that you can buy online, all for around £20, and all pretty undetectable in traditional background checking processes. So we just mentioned that to really highlight, are you aware of how quickly, the landscape is changing, David? And then I think you also might have a poll that you wanted to jump in with here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to launch poll number 2 now. That'll be popping up on your screens any second. Now, this one's, what is the prime reason your organization has a background screening policy? There's a few options there, but what's the number one issue for you? What are you trying to achieve? Compliance with legal requirements is a big driving factor we can see. And equally, the same number don't have a background check policy at all at the moment, which is great in terms of joining us today. Back to you, Anton. Let's talk about where insider fraud threats start.
Perfect. Thanks. I appreciate it, David. So I think the very first point in terms of the conversation today is, understanding where it begins. You've touched on insider threat, David. So I think that's something that, we've probably spoken about, but it does begin at the very beginning. So the recruitment and onboarding stage. And again, I think the previous slides that we've shown you highlight just how quickly that is evolving and why it is important to have an effective background check process or policy in place. And so I think that takes us nicely to, really the main content that we want to talk about is, why would you need to have a background check policy? What's the purpose? And so the purpose is to really help you to effectively mitigate risk. You've got to have a policy in place that must be understood by the people in your organization, and it will also help you to remain in line with industry laws, rules, and regulations. So how do you do it? Well, you want to establish and maintain a clear, consistent guideline. You want to spell out how you do it, why you do it, all of those sort of things. So that's probably enough of us to touch on there, but I think, David, you might have another poll on the next slide as well.
Yep, let's launch the next poll. So which area of background screening do you find the most challenging to keep up to date? Legal and regulatory compliance, technological advancements, industry-specific requirements, or employee privacy concerns? If there's something there that's missing, feel free to log it in the Q&A as well. Very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Lots of response there, and the big one is indeed legal and regulatory compliance. So we're going to now focus on the 4 key areas that we mentioned at the start of the webinar, and so it's going to take you through these 4 pillars.
David, so I think the real crux of how would you make sure that you have an effective background check policy, that is something that we often get asked. And I think this is the slide that you probably want to take away or to pay attention to. We believe that for you to have a successful background check program or background check policy in place, that you need to focus on 4 key areas. And so I'm going to take you across those 4 key areas that you can see on the slide now. We're going to talk about product, policy, process, and provider. And so the very first building block that you need to understand is you need to have a solid understanding of the individual background check products that will be included in your background check program or your background check policy, and how they operate, the risks that they're designed to mitigate, and why you would want to conduct those background checks. So that's the very first point if you're considering implementing a background check program, or if you're trying to, as I can see, adhere to legal and regulatory and compliance requirements, or understand how you could keep up with the industry. The very first thing is understand background check products and the way that they work and the risks that they're designed to mitigate. Once you've done that and you have an effective understanding of those products, you can begin to look at your policy. But I would not recommend that you look at your policy until you understand the individual background check products. The next step is that you do want to understand the different laws, rules, and regulations that you would need to adhere to wherever you're conducting background checks. So if it is just a UK program, that's obviously the focus that you need to have. But if you have a global or an international program, then you also need to understand the employment laws that are operating in each of those countries. So if you're working with an effective background check provider such as EBC Global, they'll be able to help you and guide you through that process as well. They won't give you legal advice. No background check provider would do that, but they will certainly give you guidance on what they would recommend you do to stay in line with industry norms. The third building block is process. So once you've understood the products and you've begun to write your policy, at the same time, you want to map your background check program or your process end to end. And so that's from the very first point that someone would touch your organization through to the day that they would begin in your organization, and actually also considering continuous rescreening. But you want to map that journey. And the reason you want to map that journey is you need to understand the candidate experience. You need it to be a positive one. And you also want or need to understand the pain points that can happen in a background check program. And that's probably the most important reason that you want to map it, because if you can identify the pain points, then you can do things to mitigate those pain points. And the last building block that we talk about is your background check provider, the very big piece of the puzzle. But the very first thing that we, again, recommend people kind of understand is that your background check provider does not own your background check program or your background check policy. You as the employer do. And it is important that you understand that and that you're able to have an effective relationship with your background check provider. Because if you know the products, you know your own internal policy, you know the way that you want your process to work, then you can engage with a background check provider that will be able to deliver what you require for your background check program. So if you're struggling at all to figure out where to begin, this is where we would recommend you do begin, with these 4 basic building blocks. What I wanted to continue the conversation on now is, how do you do that, or what is in a background check policy? And so I've put on the slide here some common inclusions. But the first thing that you kind of want to realize or understand is that a background check policy is a framework for you to outline how you operate your background check program. So, you want to figure out the background checks you're going to conduct. You want to figure out who you're going to conduct it on and why you would conduct those background checks. Then you need to consider who's involved in the process. So is your HR team involved? Is an onboarding team involved? Have you got your legal and compliance teams involved to make sure that you are adhering to things like GDPR and the Data Protection Act? Have you considered how you adjudicate those results or how you decision those results? How do you control your background check program? And this is actually quite an important one. A lot of people will have background check programs in place, but we see no control plan. And a very simple example of a control plan would be for you to get a report, for example, from EBC Global. How many background checks did you complete for my organization in the month of January? If they said 99 checks were completed and you had 105 hires join your business within that month, you've already got something wrong with your background check program. 5 or 6 people have obviously not been effectively back checked. So you can just put some very simple things into your policy to help you, mitigate the risks that are posed to you. The next one that we talk about can also be called the second line of defense in your policy. We call it the background check adjudication policy, or as I mentioned earlier, you could call this a decision matrix. And it is a really important piece of your policy puzzle, and one that is often missing or not kept up to date in people's programs. So very simply, what you want to do here is you need to list out all of the background checks that you conduct, and you need to know all of the discrepancies or issues that could occur if you were to conduct one of the background checks you're conducting. And you need to outline what your position is within your organization for that type of discrepancy or that type of issue. You need to do that so that you make fair and consistent decisions when you're reviewing background check results. And you also need to do it so you remain in line with the different laws, rules, and regulations that are in each of the countries that you would operate. The next slide is just a visual example of that. So we've kept this, hopefully you can see that okay. We've used as a guideline here a credit check in the United Kingdom. And so I won't run through all of these, but in principle, you can see on the left-hand side all of the main high-level discrepancies that could come back if you ran a credit check on someone. And then we have some columns that say no discrepancy, minor discrepancy, major discrepancy, or significant discrepancy, and we have some notes. And so what we would recommend you do is you have something like this in place for each of the background checks that you conduct, and you place your position in one of those columns. So for example, where we have here no adverse credit history, it says no discrepancy. So that would mean that obviously if you don't have a problem with that. But if we move down and we can see it says any satisfied or unsatisfied adverse credit over 5,000, British pounds, you're saying it's a significant discrepancy, and the note says that it's escalated to committee for review. So what that would mean is that you're not comfortable if someone has credit to the level of £5,000 and you want a group of people to review that result to take a decision. So you're mapping out exactly, the steps that someone should take if they are reviewing your background check policy or they're reviewing an individual result. So we often get asked, how do I enhance an existing policy? Now, I think I saw from the polls that David did earlier that some of you have policies, some of you don't. We can cover this from both sides, whether you have an existing policy or whether you need to write a new policy. The first thing here is to be comprehensive. So go back to those 4 building blocks and take a look at each of them to help you create the policy, and learn your background check products, the risks that they're designed to mitigate. Figure out whether you're conducting them in line with other people in your industry. Are you doing too much? Are you doing too little? Is it taking too long? You need to do a little bit of investigation there to help you have a comprehensive and effective policy. The next one I've listed here is to be consistent. So again, having a policy helps you to be consistent, and it helps you to apply the same adjudication process or standard to all of your new hires and all of your existing employees. And that's really important for lots and lots of reasons. The next one that we list here is to be compliant. And so I noticed that some of you have listed here, quite a lot of you, that you want to adhere to laws, rules, and regulations. Well, your policy will help you do that if you keep it current. So that jumps to the next one, right? There's no point putting a policy in place and it's not touched for 6 to 12 months. It does need at least an annual or a biannual review. And it would be important to have control plans in place to make sure that your policy is actually being compliant. So yeah, I think that's the main thing that I would say here is, how would you enhance it, is cover the 4 Cs, we call it on this slide. We called it the 4 Ps on the earlier slide, and this one we actually call the 4 Cs. So hopefully there's a couple of things there that you can take from that slide. I think, David, you also had a poll that you wanted to do at this point too.
Yeah, some great advice and insight there, Anton. Thank you so much for that. Now, I'm sure there's still some questions being formed in the audience, and whilst you think about whether or not to post them in the Q&As, let's just jump into this poll. This one is being launched now, should pop on screen, and it's what additional resources or support would help you enhance your background screening policy. Now, this one's actually a multi-picker, so we really just want to understand what help and support we can potentially provide as follow-ups, but we need to know where these gaps are currently appearing. So let's see those results come through. Quite a steady split. Top of the charts at the moment is access to industry knowledge and best practice guidance. which is great news for Anton and for I. Those numbers are still changing, but we'll just move on for now in the interest of time. Anton, just pass back over to you to discuss this special offer that you'd like to talk about.
So I think that quite nicely, to the poll that you've just shown there, David. So, obviously, those of you that may have looked at the background check advisory while we're speaking, or if you'd like to look at the background check advisory, we put some details on the screen here. So the website is obviously thebackgroundcheckadvisory.com. My email address is also here. So one of the things that we have offered in partnership with EBC Global is for those of you that would like some assistance with your background check policy, whether it be creating a new policy, whether revamping an existing policy, or understanding the different laws, rules, and regulations that you need to adhere to. We are offering a special offer here today that you can see on the slide, which would allow you to get some of that independent expert advice. We'll send the slide decks out, I think, with the offer after today's presentation. And one of the other things that we will also do is just send a one-page guide that is both from EBC Global and the Background Check Advisory, figuring out where would you begin, just sort of covering the main points that I've touched on in the slide today, which we often find is quite helpful for people. But yeah, if this is of interest to you, or if you'd like to reach out to me directly, please do so. My email address is there. I'd love to have a conversation if I could help in any way. And David, I'm sure it's the same from your side as well.
100%, Anton. Thank you so much. And just a heads up, guys, that if you go onto the Background Check Advisory website, there is a calendar where you can book a 30-minute meeting with Anton directly, where you can finalize the details to take up the offer as well. So please look out for that on the website. So now we're going to hand it over to you. I've noticed quite a few questions popping in during the course of the webinar. So let's kick off with number one. Interesting one. What's the best way to go about creating an adjudication decision matrix? Yep, there are just so many different checks and variables. Do you have any best practice guidance, Anton?
Yeah, the simple answer is we could help you with that. Because obviously we have experience of doing this for many years with different organizations. So essentially, really the first thing is to go back to the products. If you wanted to try and do this yourself, you need to understand what is the background check product, what is the risks it's designed to mitigate, and then you begin to have, thoughts or questions around that. So another example, if you're talking about an employment reference, what is the issue that could come back? The issue that could come back is they didn't work there, their salary was wrong, they were let go for gross misconduct, or they received a written warning. So you begin to think of all of the different discrepancies that could come out, and you begin to write those down. Another really good way is if you connected to people in your own industry, have a conversation with them. What is their view on the type of discrepancies that they accept? A lot of people are quite willing to share and have conversations around that sort of stuff.
Yeah. As important to keep the adjudication matrix up to date as it is the overriding policy as well. Things change, lessons are learned. It's an incredibly powerful and helpful document and shouldn't be overlooked by employers for sure. Next question was actually around rescreening. Where do you suggest that we start with rescreening, and do we need to have a separate rescreening policy, or should this all be combined into one? Good question, but do you want to tackle that one, Anton?
I think you need to look at it a little bit as a separate policy. A lot of the principles will still apply, but the laws, the rules, and regulations will be very different for the screening that you're going to do on an existing employee than it will be on a potential employee. So that's the main thing that you need to consider. And you need to really make sure that if you're talking about rescreening, that it's very fair and it's very consistent across your organization. So I think the same principles apply, but there are some nuances because obviously you're talking about existing employees rather than potential employees. So that's the main difference. I think that can be done at the same time, but you just need to have a different lens on both of those.
Yeah, fantastic. Great answer. Another really interesting question here, and this is coming from somebody who doesn't have an employment screening policy in place at the moment. Quite a few people actually answered this way, but they've asked, what role or department in an organization would typically be responsible for creating and maintaining the background check policy? What do you find from, and I know it'll be different from organizations to organization, but thinking security, compliance, HR, what's your experiences around this, Anton?
Yeah, I think traditionally it's a combination of two. It's usually human resources and global corporate security and your compliance teams. Traditionally, it's probably owned by the human resources department, but it has buy-in from lots of different departments within the organization, HR, compliance, legal, all of that. So I think it does depend, David, on the structure of your organization and also how big your organization is. But I guess the better way to maybe answer that it's important to have one policy owner. You don't want it to be owned by by several different departments. It becomes difficult. And I'd recommend that you don't have it owned by, for example, the talent acquisition group or your recruitment teams. It needs to have an independent owner or oversight, essentially.
Great stuff. Well, thank you very much for covering those Q&As so well. We're almost at the end of the session, but before we just kind of jump into what's coming next, I'd like to thank everybody from the bottom of my heart for joining us today, taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. And of course, thank you so much, Anton, for your expert analysis and guidance. I really hope that somebody here takes up the offer to benefit from a policy review and even some screening training from Background Check Advisory. And I'm sure that we'll be welcoming Anton back later in the year for another deep dive into another topic that affects us all. So Anton, thanks ever so much. Greatly appreciated and enjoyable as always. But in terms of what's next, normally I'd be telling you about what's coming next in our webinar series, but not this time. I can tell you that I'll be delighted to be welcoming Kat Scott from Catherine Rose Consultancy to join me on March the 25th to cover healthcare vetting. But for our next webinar topic, we'd really like you to make the choice. So it's time for me to launch the final poll. Bear with. There it is. We've shortlisted 3 topics to discuss, and this one you can rank. So from the most interested to the least interesting topic, if you can just change those rankings, and we will use that to guide the content for our next webinar series. A lot of interest in HMRC and employment verification checks, which is great to know. So yeah, let's just let those votes come on in, and very grateful for you all for voting. So thanks again. We're going to make it an on-time finish today. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks, Anton, for being here with your expert insight, and looking forward to welcoming as many of you back to our next session on the 25th of February as possible. But until then, keep calm and carry on checking. Goodbye all.